Hello, my name is Julie Watkins, and I will be hosting today's travelogue brought to you by the Geographic Society of Chicago. Since 1898, the Geographic Society of Chicago has educated the public about geography and its important uses. Today's GSC trains students in the latest geospatial technology. Through services such as our community mapping projects, we offer unique educational experiences that harness the power of maps and the integrative tools of GIS to solve environmental and community issues. Together, our board and membership provide educational opportunities for students and educators, assist in building geographic materials collections in educational and cultural institutions, promote new and emerging technologies and problem solving, and much more. With us to present today is Cynthia Clampitt. Cynthia Clampitt is a writer, speaker, and food historian. She's pursued her love of culture, history, and food through her travels to 37 countries on 6 continents so far, but has in recent years focused on her love of the Midwest, the American Midwest. Clampitt's newest book about this region is Destination Heartland, a guide to discovering the Midwest's remarkable past, which will be out in spring 2022. She's also the author of Pigs, Pork, and Heartland Hogs, From Wild Boar to Bacon Fest, as well as the book Midwest Maize, How Corn Shaped the U.S. Heartland. Clampitt is a member of the Culinary Historians of Chicago, the Society of Women Geographers, the Agricultural History Society, and the Midwestern History Association. So with that, I will pass things over to Cynthia. Thank you for being here, Cynthia.
Destination Heartland History. You know, the reason I titled it Destination Heartland History is because there's an awful lot to see in the Heartland other than just history. We've got, nature, we've got beauty, we've got fabulous, zoos and museums and adventures and everything else. But the focus of this presentation, as well as the focus on my new book, is the history and where you can learn about it, most particularly, because there is an awful lot of history that is easily visited and absolutely wonderfully fun. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the history of the Midwest is that back in the 1800s, philosophers all thought of this as being where America started. In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, Europe goes to the Alleghenies and then the United States starts on the other side. So it is one of those places where people saw it as being where America began. It is where we came up with the idea of rugged individualism, because it was harder to be an individual when you lived in a big city as it was opposed to living out in the wilderness. It gave rise to so many of the icons, so much of what we think of when we think of American history. Everybody from Wyatt Earp to the Wright brothers, Buffalo Bill to Henry Ford. It really developed a tremendous amount of our culture, but it also developed it at an unbelievable speed. One of the things that I think is fun, it's one of my first favorite examples of the speed with which it grew, is two people from Wisconsin. Laura Ingalls Wilder, hard to imagine anyone more associated with the wilderness than the Ingalls family. And Frank Lloyd Wright, hard to imagine anyone more associated with the modern world and how things were changing. And they were born 4 months apart, 1867. So it just gives you some idea how fast things were changing. Okay. The Midwest starts in what was called the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory was won by the British from the French in the French and Indian War. And then the British said we couldn't settle there, that nobody was allowed to move out there. So after the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris said, yes, you get to move out to the Northwest Territory. Now, the part of the West is easy to figure out because we're west of the original 13 colonies, but the North means north of the Ohio River. So it's not that it's so far north, but it's north of the Ohio River. The Northwest Territory is, as you can see, it's what became Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It was tremendously important because by this point, there have been so many people moving into the original 13 colonies that there was not enough land to support them. People were going hungry. There was problem with disease and crime and all sorts of other stuff, all the stuff that we associate with overcrowding. And particularly back then when 98% of the population farmed, land was absolutely vital. There was no, information industry that you could go and work in. It was like if you didn't farm, even if you were a doctor, you still had a farm. If you didn't farm, you didn't eat. So anyway, new land was really key. And so they began to move out there. Um, Laws were immediately passed to try and protect this region. And it was fascinating to see because, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington had a big hand in passing the laws that would govern this area. And one is that it would be small farms, but most important, it was religious freedom and no slavery. Slavery was forbidden in the Northwest Territory. Then from there, after 1803, you had the Louisiana Purchase. You could see the Louisiana Purchase. It was one of those things where we bought it from the French because Napoleon needed money. But before the French were there, the Spanish had owned it for a while. But before that, the French had owned it. So it was very much a mixed bag. Mostly it was the French part that we ended up with, which is why we have so many names that sound French, like Marseille and Des Moines, although we intentionally mispronounce it so that it doesn't sound European. So anyway, a lot of people will say, oh, Nebraska and Kansas shouldn't really be included in the Midwest. And yet, interestingly enough, those in fact were the first two states that were called the Middle West. They are middle between Spanish territory and the Northern Territory, because once Louisiana Purchase was purchased, it became the new Northwest Territory. So if you look at the map, you can see there's the green part that was Spanish, and the northern part was the Northwest Territory. And so it's an up and down middle as opposed to a coast to coast middle, even though it is also pretty much in the middle, coast to coast. But Nebraska and Kansas were seen as the Middle West because of the North and Spanish, between the North area and Spanish territory. Oh, and just in case you're curious, not only was there a Northwest Territory, there was also a Southwest Territory immediately below the river, but that almost immediately got renamed as Tennessee. So anyway, a lot of developments happening very quickly there. That's like a 10-year period. Button. Here we go. Of course, today a lot of people refer to it as Flyover Territory, and I think by the time you're through with this, you'll understand why I disagree with that. Although I will say the one nice thing about flying over is you could see what a remarkable job they did with the surveying, because it was Thomas Jefferson that sent everybody out to do the townships where it was 6 miles to a side and could easily be divided into 160-acre farms. And as you fly over, even today, you can see how straight all those lines were that they were putting out there at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. But anyway, it's definitely not flyover country. It is physically beautiful. It still has a staggering amount of open space. It's famous for its plains and prairies. Plains and prairies are different. Plains are level or rolling and treeless, and prairies are grasslands. So minor difference in point, except that plains just don't have trees. And that's one of the things that's kind of interesting is if you go across the plains today, you'll see trees everywhere, but they've all been planted since Europeans arrived, because there were no trees on the plains when they first arrived. We also, in the North Woods, though, that was the plains. We also have the North Woods, which are absolutely spectacular. Nobody needs to apologize for the beauty of this place. We also have impressively large amounts of water. It's one of those things, we may not have any mountains, but I mean, seriously, that's the Mississippi River. Can you imagine how daunting that was for the early pioneers as they were coming across the country and going, holy cow, how do we get across that? One of the great rivers of the world. And then of course you get the Great Lakes. This is Lake Michigan, and that's like 20% of all the fresh water on the planet. So a stunning amount of water. And that's between the 5 lakes. When I say 20% of all the fresh water, that's the 5 lakes of the Great Lakes. But they thought they'd reached the ocean, and it was really sort of disheartening to find out that they still had the whole rest of the country to go. Of course, people think of it as being flat, but there's a lot of places that aren't flat. This is the Starved Rock Park in Illinois. This is the Monument Rocks in Kansas. And each region is wonderful. Each region has fabulous stuff to look at. But the Midwest, it's like there are other places with cooler rocks. And nobody else has water like we do, but other places with cool rocks. But what we have that's unbelievable is the history. So I'm going to focus a little on that. And what I'm going to do is suggest a couple of ways that you can plan your visits and plan setting things up. And the first one is themes or interests. Those of you who have been will recognize this immediately as Monk's Mound at Cahokia. Cahokia, Illinois is near St. Louis. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Interestingly, Cahokia was not built by the Cahokia. The Cahokia were the Indians that lived there when the French arrived. And so the French named this area Cahokia because that's the people who were living there then. But Cahokia was built by a Mississippian mound building culture that had vanished long before Europeans arrived, 1350. There are lots of theories about why it vanished. Overcrowding, overhunting. I think that's partly because 1350s were the beginning of the Little Ice Age. And if you're running around with not much clothing, it's really hard to stay someplace like Illinois and just deal with the cold. So there's a lot of things that happened that made it less appealing. Also, the people in Cahokia rerouted one of the rivers and caused terrible flooding. So lots and lots of reasons of why they might have. But anyway, Monk's Mound is the largest and most obvious feature. It actually covers 14 acres, and it is the largest prehistoric earthenware structure in North America. Now, there are lots of other mounds. None of them are this big, but there are roughly 70 mounds left of what they think must have been about 120 mounds when it was first built. Now, you want to wander around and explore the mounds, but then you want to go to the museum because the museum is fabulous and offers so much more information. Now, this is a painting inside the museum, painted by somebody named William Insminger, who was the director or assistant director of the museum for a long time. And you can see the large structure in the middle, and that is Monk's Mound as it would have been. Another thing that you can see if you go is, if you see to the far left, there's a circle that might kind of remind you of Stonehenge, and that's why they call it Woodhenge. And it had that same purpose. It was a calendar. But that's just one of many things you can see in there. They have fabulous displays that are similar to other museums, like this one of different ways of hunting. And so that's wonderful. But the other thing, one of the things that makes it really remarkable is that you can actually walk through a village. They've recreated an entire village. And anyway, it's remarkable being able to see exactly how people lived. Now, one of the other things that is remarkable is that in 1200, this had a population just about the same as London. And you could see life was obviously different, but it had a population of about 15 to 20,000 people. Now, that's not the only place to go check out fabulous stuff from Native Americans. In fact, all 12 of the Midwest states have wonderful, wonderful venues for visiting history, including Native American history. This is the Mitchell, in Mitchell, South Dakota. A lot of people know Mitchell for the Corn Palace, but this is the Archaeodome, which was developed sort of inspired by the dome that goes over the Terracotta Army in China. And the idea is that it protects the dig site so that they can dig year round and they don't have to shut it down or cover it up every time it snows. And this is, not only does it protect the dig site, but it allows continued work. And so far, more than 1.5 million artifacts have been discovered at this site. These are actually people that lived here from about 900 to 1000 AD. And so they headed north after they ran out of trees. That's the downside of the plains, not too many trees. So they ran out of trees and moved further north and were probably the ancestors of the Mandan Indians that Lewis and Clark met 800 years later. This just shows you typical pottery from Mitchell, and this is Mississippian style. And so it's either Mississippian people were here or they were trading, because they had fabulous trade routes. You can see how extensive the trade routes were. And you go across the Midwest and you find, you know, seashells and copper and stuff from everywhere. And here's a reconstruction of one of their homes, which is in the museum that's on the site. One of the things that was interesting too, food related, is in a world where trade was so important, the thing that they had to trade here in Mitchell was pemmican, which is made from dried meat and fat and berries. And it's sort of like early beef jerky. It would last forever in your bag if you were wandering. So, okay. Now closer to home, this is the Mitchell Museum of Native Americans, or the Mitchell Indian Museum in Evanston, Illinois. And one of the things that you will notice here, as opposed to in Mitchell, is this one starts with history, but then moves up to the modern day. And this is pretty common in all the Native American museums you'll see, is they emphasize that they don't want us to see, have the be perceived as just part of the past, that they're still around, they still have a Native American culture, they still have a lot of their art forms, they still have, their traditions. And so almost all the Native American museums, other than archaeological sites where the people are gone, will focus on the past all the way through the present. Now, here's an example of one that does that well. This one is up in Oneida Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And this one is, this is an example of the inside of a longhouse, but this is an example of more up to date. Most Native American cultures valued warriors, and the Oneida in particular were they fought alongside Americans every war all the way back to the American Revolution. So they have the longest hardcore military history associated with the United States. But the thing I thought was interesting is they were also code talkers. When people talk about code talkers, they are almost always talking about the Navajo, which were the best, probably the most widely known of the code talkers. But the Oneida were also code talkers. They have a great database here too of veterans. Now up in Minnesota, this trading post actually has, this is in Mille Lac, is on the Mille Lac Reservation in Minnesota. It has the largest range of Native American crafts of any source in the state of Minnesota. But the main reason I pointed out is because it's the only clue you have that you've reached the Ojibwa Museum, because as you can see, there's no sign out front. So you see the trading post and you've gotten to where you want to be. Now the Ojibwa, also known as the Chippewa, and it's interesting, Ojibwa and Chippewa are the same people, and yet groups that call themselves Ojibwa do not call themselves Chippewa, and vice versa. So they are essentially the same people, and yet slight differences. So anyway, the interesting thing about the museum is that a lot of the signs are in both English and Ojibwa. Now, there's a large area inside that has changing exhibits. And this one was there, I was there in 2019, and 2019 was the 100-year anniversary of the invention of the Jingle Dress. If you've ever been to a powwow or any of the Native American presentations, you'll usually see women in jingle dresses. The jingles were originally made from can lids, but nowadays they just buy sheet metal. But the dress jingles when you walk and when you dance, particularly when you dance. And it was invented here in this Ojibwa reservation. But one of my favorite places, there's also a fabulous timeline that goes all the way around the back of the building, and it takes you from 1750 when they arrived all the way up to present day. But one of my favorite parts is what they call the seasons room. And the seasons room takes you through the 4 seasons of the Ojibwa year. This is spring, and spring is when you make maple syrup. And so that's what they show here. Now, one of the things that makes this museum a kind of interesting, well, kind of more interesting than just showing what life was like, is every person in this was modeled after somebody who lived on the reservation. So people can come here and see their relatives and recognize them. So it was, it's remarkable effort on their part to make it authentic. And here's summer. Summer is fishing and hunting and preserving things, and the beginning of wild rice. Wild rice is still incredibly important in this region. And in fact, wild rice is tied to why they believe they're there. They were told by a prophet to move west until they found a place where food grew in the water. And that's what wild rice does. It's a watercress. Oh, another thing that's fun, almost every one of these places caters not only to adults, but to kids. And one of the things they do here is there are 13 stuffed animals around, and stuffed, I mean, like taxidermied and not toys, in the forest and everything around this. And kids can win, a prize for identifying them all, finding them all. Here's a little bit closer to home. This is in Romeoville, which is near Joliet. And this is interesting in that it's the beginning of the connection between Native Americans and Europeans. This is called Île à la Cache because it's on an island in the Des Plaines River. And Île à la Cache basically means the island where you hide stuff. And that's what the French voyageurs used it for. And what we start to see here is that, and of course the French were here long before the United States even existed, because this was all French territory from the start. So anyway, what we begin to see here is the adoption of things on both sides, basically Native Americans adopting things that they're getting from the West, and of course the people from all the Europeans adopting all these things from the Native Americans. So they started using the canoe, they started using dressing a lot like the Native Americans, because Native American skills and abilities were all very much appropriate for the world that they lived in, as opposed to what the Europeans had left behind. And so they adopted a great deal, and the Native Americans adopted a great deal. And both saw, this is an interesting sign, both sides saw this as being wonderful. You did have a lot of intermarrying and stuff too, but both sides loved the stuff they were getting. The French loved the knowledge, they loved the canoes, they loved the skills. They particularly loved the fur pelts, because the Native Americans were like, sure, we'll give you, pelts if you give us, rifles and tools and metal pots. And so anyway, it was just a huge bonus on both sides. And so it was one of those things. And interestingly enough, it's one of those things where they mention here, it's like, well, how could they go back the way they were when they had all these things, that it's, damaging the culture because they have all these wonderful things now from the Europeans. And it was like, what culture in the history of the world hasn't changed as new things became available? I mean, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't have computers. So it's just one of those things where it's sort of inevitable. You meet somebody who has something you want, you like it, you trade for it. Anyway, this is when it starts to change slightly. This is when we start to see the beginning of the change. The Europeans start coming in larger numbers because, oh my gosh, look at all this fabulous stuff that this country has, especially land, because even the people who were here trading still valued the land, because that was still how most of the world survived. And then, of course, as the French come in larger numbers, they soon actually start building cities. This is St. Genevieve, which is about an hour south of St. Louis. It offers the largest concentration of French Creole homes in the United States. So even bigger than New Orleans. So, and it's wonderful. If you go in there, some of the signs are in French. And I met people there that were actually still being, people still living in some of these houses. I mean, a lot of these are still being used. And this goes all the way back to, well, they first settled in 1719 in this area, but then they moved a little bit inland just because the Mississippi River kept flooding. So a lot of these buildings have been here since 1795, which is where this site started. Definitely worth a visit. Bulldog House is one of the houses that's been kept aside for visitors as opposed to people still living in it. This is one of the oldest homes in the town. And here you can see one of the things, this is a wall that they've stripped off just to show you the remarkable construction. Log cabins, but the logs were vertical instead of horizontal. And the thing that they figured that made this a benefit is because this area was hit hard by the New Madrid Fault earthquakes, if you're familiar with that epic. Whereas horizontal logs, when the earthquakes hit, the logs would just roll off. I mean, it destroyed everything. Whereas here, the logs just swayed. So all the buildings survived that horrific time with with the earthquakes. But this shows you, this is still inside the Bulldog House. This shows you that they were very, very successful. This area, St. Genevieve, and St. Genevieve alone makes you understand what the ambition they had for this area, because St. Genevieve is the patron saint of Paris. And so they were definitely thinking this was going to be it. And so anyway, they were known as the breadbasket of New Orleans. They still traded with the Native Americans, but they were also by this point in time mining and raising wheat and making sugar and maple syrup especially, and just hugely successful. And so as a result, you can, like I said, see that, you know, the pretty nice house for out in the wilderness. Okay, come on, go next. There we go. Okay, and then we switch now. This is not the most posh restaurant in St. Genevieve, but it is the oldest brick building west of the Mississippi. So that's why I picked it for dinner. When I go back, I will probably pick one of the fabulous French restaurants in town, but I was into old when I was there. So this is the oldest building, but this also sort of triggers my next theme, which is food, because I'm a food historian. Oldest restaurant in Illinois is the Village Tavern in Long Grove. Long Grove, interestingly enough, was also the very first town to be made a historic district in Illinois. It was started in 1847. So still a wonderful place to eat. Unlike the old brick house, this is a place where you go for the good food. This is just up over the border in Wisconsin. This is the Wilmot stage stop. This was on the once important route between Galena and Kenosha. That's another thing you learn as you travel around the Midwest, is places that are important today were not necessarily important then, and vice versa. So there were some places that were absolutely thriving, huge, important places that are kind of nice backwaters now. So anyway, this was hugely important. It was opened in 1848, the year that Wisconsin became a state. They no longer have hotel rooms, but the upstairs, the ground floor is a restaurant, great steakhouse, very Wisconsin with, brandy drinks and lots of dairy products. But the 2 floors above are a museum now. So you can see what the dance hall was like. You can see some of the other things that they had. And then on the top floor, you can see what the rooms were like, because of course, back then, a trip from Galena to Kenosha was a couple of days trip. Okay, Hayes House. This is in Council Grove, Kansas. Council Grove, Kansas was just listed as one of the 15 small towns in the United States that you ought to see by the Smithsonian. So they did that after I'd been there. So I was really pleased to know that they liked it as well as I did. But Hayes House is kind of fun because not only is it the oldest continuously operational restaurant west of the Mississippi, started, as you can see from this picture, 1857, but it was built by Seth Hayes. And Seth Hayes was the great grandson of Daniel Boone. He was a cousin of Kit Carson. So talk about being locked in on lots of levels of history. And he was sent to work with the Kansas Indians, Kansas being, of course, where we get the name Kansas. Anyway, so he was sent there. He was the very first European in this area. And the whole town is just charming and historic. But if you can see it down there on the lower right corner of the picture of Hayes House, there's don't expect to read it, but there's a brown sign. And what the brown sign is telling you is that this is the Santa Fe Trail. That road in front of the restaurant actually was why it was built there, is it was built right on the Santa Fe Trail. So lots of history. And this one is in Nebraska, Columbus, Nebraska. And Glur's Tavern is where Buffalo Bill used to hang out. You can see the further west you get, the more they're into advertising who they are. I will say one of the things you will discover too, as you go to some of these places, they don't necessarily capture the menu that existed at the time that these places were open, but they capture the feel. And of course, there's a certain degree to which they will capture the menu items, because pretty much the Midwest is steak. So all of them will have beef in some form. But basically what it is if it's a tavern where somebody like Buffalo Bill would hang out, they have burgers and fries. Whereas if you go to some place like the Long Grove Tavern. They have, you know, really hot, more high-end food because this was a place that you'd go out for the evening. So anyway, these places all do a pretty good job of reflecting sort of the flavor of what you would have when you were visiting back in the 1800s. Now, living history is a huge thing for me. I really love living history. And there are wonderful ones in the Midwest. Almost, I think every state has at least one. Some have two, three. I think we have at least four in Illinois. So anyway, this is just a sampling of some of the fun things that you can see when you do living history. Now, the thing about living history is, as opposed to just it's a museum and it's old, there are people in costume, there are people that are recreating what you would see. They have the old buildings, but they have people living the life. This is at Sutter Village, which is in northern Ohio. It's the largest living history venue in Ohio, not the only one, but the largest. And this gentleman represents one of the voyageurs. This is, you can see how they've adopted the clothing and even adopted the housing of the Native Americans. And here's a lady in one of the kitchens. So this is one of the things that, like I said, this is what makes living history fun, is there are people there that can show you how things were done. She's making butter. They can demonstrate the skills. They can demonstrate the life. You can see what the clothing is like. So, and they can tell you stuff. These people are usually incredibly knowledgeable and can tell you all about the life of whoever it was that lived here. Doing the woodwork. Like I said, you see so many things that you don't have, weaving and spinning wool. This one is at Stir Village, or Stir Museum of the Prairie Pioneer. This is in Nebraska. And that's the other thing you find as you go around, is every living history venue has a slightly different focus. Sutter is basically early Ohio. This is one of the railroad towns. This is what Stir represents. And what a railroad town was, is when the railroads were first being built across the Great Plains, the railroad companies would say, okay, it's been 10 miles since a town, we'll plant a town here. And so the railroad company would build a few office buildings, a few houses, and then start selling the land around it, because they had originally had all that land for their workforce. Their workforce would live there while they were building the rail. And once they moved on to the next destination, they could sell all that land. And they were selling it to people from out east, but they were also advertising in Europe. It's one of the reasons why the further west you get in the Midwest, the more multi-ethnic it is, because they were advertising all over the world saying, hi, we've got land, we'll sell you here. So that's what a railroad town was, and this represents it. And some of the best known railroad towns are, you know, Wichita and Abilene, and quite a few of the towns that we think of when we think of sort of the Wild West, and they were all railroad towns. This is a scene from the living history farms in Iowa. And the reason they have living history farms is there are actually 3 farms, and they're all separated enough by trees and land and everything else that you can't see one farm from the other. So it's very evocative. It really definitely makes you feel like you were there. And the first farm is 1750s, and it's Native American farm. And the second one is 1850, and it's a pioneer farm with the log cabin. And this is the 1900 farm. And by 1900, all of the equipment was becoming sufficiently sophisticated that you could use horses, which may not sound terribly advanced to us, but horses were much quicker and much more agile than oxen, because up until this point in time, you had to use oxen because you needed as much strength as you could possibly get to pull this. So, and that's Iowa, Des Moines. Now, this is probably the granddaddy of them all when it comes to living history venues. This is Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. And Henry Ford didn't just collect nice buildings, he collected famous buildings. That's actually a remodel or refurbished Model T built back in the early 1900s. And that's the actual Wright Brothers cycle company. And next door to it is the Wright Brothers birthplace. And you just go up and down the streets, and everybody you've ever heard of in American history, if they could possibly get their hands on. Obviously, Mount Vernon is still where it was, but pretty much Noah Webster and the Wright brothers and Edison and pretty much anybody else Henry Ford could pick up. Their buildings, all the buildings associated with them are here. So you can walk through whole towns of history. Plus, then there's also just practical history. This is one end of the place. This is actually this is all of the buildings you need to have, sort of like to create civilization. It's the sawmills and the tinsmiths and the smelters. You can see the big chimney there for things that involve heat. And so this is sort of the working end of town. This is one of those places where you really should get, and I mentioned Greenfield Village. If you look it up, you may need to look up Henry Ford Museum because, or sometimes just called the Ford. Henry Ford Museum is a two-part place. There's the museum next door, which covers 12 acres. It's so big. And then there's Greenfield Village, and that's this one, and that's 85 acres. So a lot of history. And it is a living history venue. It isn't just old buildings. It is also still costumed and doing it. And this woman is frustrated with trying to get rid of horseradish and advises if you grow horseradish, you have to keep on it because it's just like mint. It will take over the whole garden. Now, here we are in Illinois again. This is just down near Springfield. This is Lincoln's New Salem. One of the important things to remember is don't just look up New Salem, look up Lincoln's New Salem, because I know people who have gone on driving trips and gone to Salem, and Salem is not the same as Lincoln's New Salem. So Salem's a town, a modern town, and Lincoln's New Salem is this place, which is where Abraham Lincoln had his first business, the first store owned by Berry and Lincoln. And so there was a second one. He didn't do very well. And that's when people started saying, you're too smart to just take care of a store. Why don't you study law? But this place is fabulous and it's beautiful. It is a recreation. And the reason it's a recreation is because back in that day, wood was hard, you know, I shouldn't say wood wasn't hard to come by, but it was hard to process. Coming up with logs and boards as opposed to just a tree was a lot of work and took weeks and if not months. And so when you moved, you took all your wood with you. So all of these houses were carried off when people moved to other areas. But this is just, I mean, aside from being physically beautiful, it has all the houses. I mean, they knew exactly what the town was like because they have all the records. So it's all the houses, all the businesses, the taverns, everything you'd want to see. Like I said, streets and inside is just as fabulous as the outside. I mean, everything is so detailed and you get to see what life was like. And there are, again, costume participants here, interpreters. And then this one is one of my favorites. This is up in Minnesota, Grand Rapids. I always say it's the other Grand Rapids. This is Grand Rapids, Minnesota, not Grand Rapids, Michigan. One of the things, of course, the Midwest is famous for is raising food. But to be perfectly honest, we pretty much did everything that the country needed to grow. The Iron Range created all the metal that you needed to build New York. The Northwoods cut down all the trees that were needed. And that's what this one is. This is the Forest History Center, where they talk about the history of logging in this region in the big North Woods. This is the barn boss. And that's one of the things that's fun, is learning the lingo. This is the barn boss. All the trees, all of the horses would always be in pairs. And that's one of the things, if you ever go to a county fair, try to see the horse pull, because like a horse can pull, a few thousand pounds, but two horses together can pull like 10 times more. It's unbelievable how much more they can pull. But even with that, one of the things that we learned is that they did all their work in the winter. And there's two reasons for doing all the work in the winter. One of them is that you can pour water on the ground and the horses can pull even more. They can pull up to 20 tons. So that's 40,000 pounds if the ground is frozen, because then your wagon slides. So anyway, they would do it in the winter because of that. But also all the farmers were not busy in the winter. And so all the farmers would come up here. And well, I shouldn't say all of them, but all of the ones in the area would come up here and be loggers for the winter. Now, this is what your accommodation would be like. That's the black thing in the middle is the furnace that would try to keep this warm, because we're way north in Minnesota, you get kind of cold winters. It would be 2 men to a bunk. That would be another way they'd keep you from freezing to death. One of the things you see there is the accordion, and that's because the days would be short. So they had long evenings for doing interesting stuff like singing and playing music and playing cards and doing other things. But that was the saying, was they work from can see to can't see. And can see, of course, is sunrise, and can't see is sunset. The kitchens were huge and important. And in fact, they said that the second highest paid person in the entire camp would be the cook. And this was a great place for women to make lots of money because the boss of the whole operation would make the most. The cook would make the second amount because you could not hire people if you did not have a good cook. Nobody wanted to work for you if you didn't have good food. Long tables, they had 15 minutes to eat, so nobody talked at all. You just ate, but they had huge quantities of food at every meal. And then, of course, they had entertainment. And this is a couple of the interpreters showing some of the stuff they would do. I don't know if you could see there's a little figure that the woman has there. And it's one of those ones where if you bounce the log, it makes it look like the little creature's dancing. So lots of wood carving and things going on. And of course, they're singing songs from the time period. Okay, now, this is another way of planning trips. This is, one of them is an en route, one of them is a targeted town, and one is the general vicinity. The general vicinity being within a half an hour to an hour of where I live in Northern Illinois. So, okay, for en route, we start in Southern Ohio. So this is drive across Southern Ohio. This is the National Underground Railroad Museum. The Underground Railroad, of course, being that's why it says Freedom Center, is it was one of the ways that African Americans could escape the South and slavery. This is an absolutely fabulous museum. I mean, this is one of those ones where it's worth it to go to Cincinnati just for this museum. Gorgeous displays. And one of the things that's really interesting is the way they separate sections is not necessarily like walls and doors, but music. So like when you're in the area where they're talking about the British trying to get rid of slavery, they're playing Amazing Grace because that was the song that sort of centered around getting rid of slavery in the British Empire. So each section you go into will have different music, but just a gorgeous museum. And then here, just about half an hour outside of Cincinnati, is the Golden Lamb. The Golden Lamb, built in 1803, is the oldest hotel and restaurant in Ohio. It is still absolutely outstanding. The food is amazing. They do have a small section of the menu that you can order things that were on the original menu, which is basically roast beef and roast turkey. Everything else is the kind of food, like I said earlier, this is, you matched what you were in the day. And so this place is one of those ones where it tells you who raised the animals and who made the stuff, because it's all incredibly well-sourced, local, beautiful food. If you have a chance to get here, eat here. Everybody's stayed here. John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, Ronald Reagan, dozens of presidents. Charles Dickens, they actually decorated a room in memory of Charles Dickens. So you can see the rooms are pretty nice too. So very posh hotel, the Golden Lamb. Now, historic Rasco Village, this is just a little further along, still in Southern Ohio. This was a town that was originally built on a canal. There's obviously a road now, but it was built on a canal. It was in the 1820s, canals were a huge thing. Of course, you all know about the Erie Canal, but this is the Ohio and Erie Canal, which was a 308-mile canal that connected the Erie River to the Ohio, or the Lake Erie to the Ohio River. So it was an incredibly important place for getting supplies and trade and everything else, and shipping out food that had been raised here. But the thing that makes this completely different from other living history venues is it's actually still a real town. And what they do is you buy a ticket and they give you a wristband, and it's like every third building is a living history venue, and there will be an interpreter in it, and you can find out what life was like. So you've got the printing press, and you've got the blacksmith, and you've got the school teacher and everybody else, but all the buildings in between are real restaurants and real stores and real businesses. And so it's kind of interesting. And the thing about it's being a real town is it's open all year. Most living history venues are open during the summer or during, a few months on either side of the summer. just because they can't really keep them open in the middle of winter and get all of those people in there. So all the volunteers, but this is a real town. So it is open all year and they have events all year long. You can see it's just incredibly charming. The road's been paved, but the sidewalks are all still brick. And this is one of the things that's astonishing though, is the building of the canal. They had to dig the canal, then they had to carve the wood, the stone, transport the stone, fill in the canal. They had to build lakes to fill the canals with water. They had to build aqueducts for the boats to go over if they got to a place where there was like a canyon or something like that. I mean, just unbelievable amount of work involved. And yet it took them about 4.5 days per mile of canal, which is, I think, astonishing. It takes us longer than that today. And this was all done by hand as opposed to with machines. So anyway, this is a part of the abandoned canal, but there is part of the canal that's still open. And you can actually get on one of the old canal boats and travel the way they would have at the time with the horses pulling the canal boats. This is the National Road Museum. This is one of those things where I worked in educational publishing for a long time, and I've never seen this mentioned in a history book. The National, I don't mean the museum, but the National Road. It was once known as the road that built the country. It was 66, workers, they carved a path 66 feet wide. It was started in 1811. It was basically the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. But it was 66 feet wide, and it was paved. This is where it's beginning. It's sometimes called the Cumberland Road because it started in Cumberland, Maryland, and then it headed west, going from state capital to state capital as each state became a city, or as a state. And then it ended in Vandalia, Illinois, because that was, in 1837, that was the capital of Illinois. And here you can see, this is actually a diorama that they've created. It's just fabulous. It's a 136-foot long diorama that goes around the building that shows, and as you travel through the country, time changes. So you go from cutting down trees to actually traveling on the road, and then you start seeing gas stations and cars, and this is fun too, because this was the Conestoga wagon. I mean, when we think of covered wagons, we tend to think of the cute little ones we see with mom and the kids sitting on the front, in the front, steering the horses. Those were how people traveled. That was like the family car. This is like the Allied van lines. It could hold 6 tons of stuff. And so these traveled by the thousands westward. And this one I thought was great fun too. It just shows you that they could adapt. And it's, you could take off the wheels and put on sleds so that you could travel year round. Now, if you do get to the National Road Museum, worth noting is one corner of the museum is also set aside as the Zane Grey Museum, because he was born nearby. His grandfather was Ebenezer Zane, for whom Zanesville was named. But Zane Grey we remember because he actually created the genre of the Western. And speaking of the Western, Targeted Town next up. And Targeted Town has it all. It has the museums and it has the living history venue. This is Wichita, Kansas. This is the Old Cowtown Museum. It was called Old Cowtown. Well, they used to actually call Wichita Cowtown because it was one of the places where you drove your cattle to catch the train. So this was originally also a railroad town. Oh, and Wyatt Earp was the sheriff here in 1870. So that gives you some idea of how iconic this place was. And all of these buildings, I should mention, all of these buildings are buildings that were in Wichita. And when you go to the Wichita Museum, you can see the photographs of them in their original location. And they're all real museums. Every building is filled with the stuff that would be appropriate for, like the printing press still has the printing press, and just everything is exactly as it would have been. This gives you some idea. And this is one of the things that's interesting too. Wichita was built after the Civil War. And so there is no time that Wichita existed that there was not photography. So we have so much evidence of exactly what Wichita was like at the time. So anyway, so all of this stuff existed, and the grain elevator there also tells you this is the late 1800s, because the grain elevator didn't really become popular until, or I should say, late mid 1800s, but late 1850s. Lots of rides and fun things here. So the living history aspect isn't just listening to people talk, it's actually getting to do some of the stuff. And this I include just because it shows two things that were important at the time. Oysters. Oysters became a huge craze in the Midwest as soon as the trains went through. And they said it was the one thing that brought everybody together, no matter how poor you were or how rich you were, no matter what level of society, no matter what language you spoke, what continent you came from, everybody got together when oysters arrived in town. And so oysters became a huge important part of the culture. If you've ever read my book, Midwest Maize, there's actually a recipe in there for corn oysters, because when you ran out of oysters, you made fake oysters with grated corn. And then next to that, you see Turnverein. Turnverein is basically it's a German word that means gymnastics club. And you find Turnverein pretty much anywhere that Germans settled. So it's just another thing that just sort of reminds you of how varied the Midwest was. This is just a couple of blocks from Old Cowtown. This is the Mid-America All-Indian Center. Once again, the focus on their history is minor because they're more interested in the current population of Native Americans. But there is some history, but there's also a lot of present day that makes it fascinating. Now, one of the things I learned is there are between 60 and 70 different tribes living in Wichita. This has become a very popular area for Native Americans, both because there is such a large Indian presence here and also because there was always jobs. So anyway, this is an area that is kept available for powwows and meetings and gatherings, and you can see all the different tribal flags. And this is another thing, it's fabulous for the artwork. I mean, they focus on arts. I mean, they've got, pictures of like Maria Talchief, who was the Native American prima ballerina. And so there's a lot of focus on the arts. I fell in love with this guy, Black Bear Boson. He had just fabulous artwork. They have examples of it. He ended up on the cover of National Geographic and a great deal of other fabulous artwork. And so worth going to this museum just to see his work. And then they've got a video of his life. And then outside, he also designed this, the Keeper of the Plains, which overlooks the city of Wichita. And it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of African Americans to Kansas. Kansas was absolutely determined to be a free state. Missouri did not want them to be a free state. Missouri wanted them to be a slave state. So there was a considerable amount of conflict. Kansas actually became known as Bleeding Kansas because they were so often attacked for their anti-slavery stand. But they had huge numbers of African Americans coming there. There's almost no name in African American history that isn't associated with Kansas. It was the first all-Black towns were there. Nicodemus is the only one of the all-Black towns that's still there, but it was just hugely important. And people who have lived in Kansas, this is one of the things that's kind of interesting, is like Langston Hughes. I mean, we associate with him with the Harlem Renaissance, and yet he was from Kansas. Charlie Bird Parker, Hattie McDaniel, the first African American to win an Oscar. George Washington Carver, Gwendolyn Brooks. I mean, she was the poet laureate of Illinois, and yet she was born in Kansas. So just huge numbers of famous African Americans, but it was just a huge, enormous part. Now, one of the things you can see there, the Kansas African American History Trail, that is something you can get when you're there as a passport. And this is one of the stops on that trail, and you can go to the historic sites and get your passport punched. Now, when you get in here, you'll recognize the fact that this is like the Native American place, a place for gathering, and yet they have fabulous displays downstairs of artwork done by current African Americans, plus the back room is all artwork brought from Africa. But in this room, the whole upstairs is photographs and life stories of important African Americans associated with Kansas history. And a couple of ones I really loved. This one, I had actually read about him beforehand. He's Bass Reeves, sometimes known as the real Lone Ranger. 3,000 arrests, absolutely remarkable history. And one of the things that made it particularly nice that I knew who he was is that my guide pointed out her name, and she's Ilona Reeves. So she's actually a relative. So that just shows you that the African American history is still alive and well in Kansas. And then oh, come on. There we go. I thought this was fascinating because being a food historian, Junius Groves was the potato king of the world. He became one of the wealthiest African Americans in the United States because he was so good at growing potatoes. I mean, they even built a railroad spur out to his farm just because he had such a huge success. So, and then finally, the last must see in Wichita, and this is not the last must see, this is just the last must see of his early history. And this one is the County Museum. It used to be the City Hall, and now it's the County Museum. And here you can learn about all the people who are famous. Wichita is the first place anyone ever played an electric guitar. It is where a farmer named Clyde Cessna created the Cessna airplane. It's the Chisholm Trail. In fact, the road right in front of that building is the Chisholm Trail, which is, so famous. And it's just, anyway, it's just a remarkable place to put together all of the other pieces of the history of the region. And then here, just back at home, now this is in the general vicinity. This is all the stuff that's pretty close to where I am here in Northern Illinois. This is the Grove. This is in Glenview. If you ever get a chance, you could say it's like, well, that doesn't look so impressive. Well, the guy who built it, Dr. John Kennicott, actually lived there for a long time in a log cabin before he could build this house. But John Kennicott was famous for a couple of things. I mean, first of all, he had an idea that for a long time was known as the Illinois idea. And that was the thing he was promoting until they finally got somebody in Washington, D.C. to do it. And it became known as the Morrill Act, also known as the Land Grant Act. So basically, this is where all of our universities were born, because the Land Grant Act was the act that said that every state would be given land so that it could create universities. So the University of Illinois, in a way, started here, and the University of pretty much everywhere else in the country. So, but it also is, he was also the founder of the Illinois State Fair. He started a magazine. He carved out this whole area that is now a wildlife and nature reserve that's really beautiful to wander through. But he also raised his kids amazingly well. And he believed in equal education for women as well as for boys. But his son, Robert, is the one that actually almost became more famous than his dad, in spite of all of those things. And Robert became one of the first major collectors for the Smithsonian Institution. He started the Chicago Academy of Science. And he was so well known as a collector and an explorer that they sent him out to what was known at the time as Russian America to explore it. And his exploration of Russian America, which we now know as Alaska, so he convinced Seward to buy the place. So between the two of them, they've added a little bit to our culture. And so definitely worth visiting and learning more about them. Interestingly enough, with all that Robert Kennicott accomplished, he was actually dead by the age of 30. He had a bad heart. So it's like, I feel like sometimes like, okay, what have I done with my life? Computer. There we go. Napier Settlement. Napier Settlement's in Naperville, Illinois. It was founded in 1831. One of the fun things I learned is that it was a lot of Germans here, and there was a young man named Adolf Kors who started out his brewing career here before moving out to Colorado. And this shows two things. One of the things you will find pretty much everywhere you go is a blacksmith shop, because everybody relied so heavily on blacksmiths, because you had to have it. It wasn't just for shoeing your horses. It was like if you needed a door lock, if you needed a nail, if you needed, I mean, it was just everything. If you needed a metal pot, if you needed the handle put back on your metal pot, the blacksmiths did it all. But the other thing worth noting is the stone, because Naperville was built on a huge outcrop of limestone. And so they provided a huge amount of limestone for building the region in the mid 1800s. This is Klein Creek Farm. This is in West Chicago. Klein Creek Farm, I first got to know Klein Creek Farm during their corn festival where I would walk through the fields picking corn and shucking it and throwing it into that basket or into that, you know, wagon there. And they have sort of things like that all the time where you can participate and learn more. The thing that makes this different as a living history venue than others is it's not a collection of buildings, it is a single farm, but absolutely everything about the farm is there and working. So you have the farm, you have the plants being grown, you've got all the animals and everything else. Fabulous kitchen, all the modern conveniences. You can see the bathtub in the back there, so you can heat water on the stove and then have a bath. The thing worth noting is all of these kitchens in these living history venues are working kitchens. You actually do cook stuff. You can see some biscuits there. And one of the things I love is this one. And this is another aspect of the living history venues I love, is kids are welcome. Obviously, you can tell that these are not here as tourists. A lot of living history venues actually have programs where you can get school credit for history and for social studies by working on them. And if you don't happen to have a place where they have school credit, you could just, you know, if your parents are there volunteering for the summer, the kids can volunteer too. So it is not uncommon to see a lot of kids at some of these venues for living history. You see what history is really like. Galena, Illinois was once a hugely important town. Everybody in the 1800s stayed here. Lincoln spoke here. He stayed at the hotel in town. Ulysses S. Grant had a home here. He also had his headquarters when he was running as president. It used to be a really important town for metal and for mining, and there's lots of mines still. But anyway, it's one of those places where you could spend days and days. And then here in Joliet, I loved this in Joliet. What they did is instead of just having walls, they actually turned the walls into some of the exhibit. And Joliet, once again, a lot of limestone. And so they were part and parcel of building the very important I&M Canal. The I&M Canal is sometimes referred to as the canal that made Chicago great, because it was like Chicago, once Chicago was connected by the I&M Canal to the Illinois River, that gave it access to the Mississippi. And that basically meant we could trade anywhere in the world from Chicago. So, but I&M Canal, a lot of the workers were from Joliet, plus the stone was quarried there. But it also suggests the wealth of Joliet at the time, between the Rialto Theater and the stained glass. It was just a really fabulous. It was also made most of the horseshoes in the country. So you just keep learning stuff that you didn't know. And then this is just up over the border in Kenosha, the Civil War Museum. This is a really remarkable museum. It's one of the affiliates with the Smithsonian, so I guess that makes it a little less remarkable that the Smithsonian's involved. But it focuses on the part that the upper Midwest played in the Civil War, because basically the Union could not have won without the upper Midwest. And it wasn't just the food we supplied, it was also the amount of metal. I mean, you know, like 6,000 tons of copper coming out of Michigan, and of course the humans, I mean, the bodies, just an immense amount of volunteers from the upper Midwest. So just a tremendous museum if you get a chance to see it. There's also like a 360-degree movie inside that's heartrending, that shows basically what all of those cute farm boys ran into when they headed into war. And so much more. This is just basically a few things. This is, I call it icons and opportunities. Because of the lakes, there's a lot of boating stuff. And here is in this is in the Michigan Maritime Museum, Friends Goodwill. If you take a ride on this boat, they actually encourage you to participate in putting up the sails, taking down the sails. So you can actually sort of relive that. This is an antique boat. And then you've got up near Traverse City, this lighthouse actually has a program where you can sign up and be a lighthouse keeper for a week. And you don't have, the lighthouse itself is now automatic, so you don't have to worry about somebody drowning because you forgot to turn on the lights, but you have to keep the windows clean and you meet people. And then the rest of the time you just enjoy the beauty of the surroundings because it's in the wilderness there. Also, for people who like this sort of thing, it's on the 45th parallel. So you're halfway between the equator and the North Pole. diversity is underscored by a lot of the places. This is Windmill Island in Holland, Michigan. So huge Dutch presence here. This is the Turner Hall up in Monroe, Wisconsin. This is believed to be the last Swiss Turner Hall. There were lots of German ones, but this is Swiss. But Monroe, Wisconsin is the Swiss cheese capital of the United States. So Swiss settlers. This is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. This is the Czech and Slovak Museum. There's so many Czechs, and I always love this story. There's so many Czechs in Iowa that when Antonin Dvorak was in New York conducting and he got homesick, they didn't send him back to Czechoslovakia, they sent him to Iowa. And he was perfectly happy there, and that's where he wrote his famous New World Symphony. This used to be the German house. It's now called the Athenaeum in Indianapolis. It holds the Rathskeller, which is the oldest restaurant in Indianapolis. But the thing I think is kind of fun is it was designed by Kurt Vonnegut's grandfather. And then we get the icons, you know, the Pony Express. The Pony Express started in Missouri, and here's the Pony Express Museum in St. Joseph. And this is actually the original stable for the Pony Express. This is Fort Mandan up in North Dakota. This was where Lewis and Clark wintered at the beginning of their trip. You've probably heard of sod houses. I think it's interesting how much a sod house looks like Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Style, which is sort of a fun play on words. And this is Mark Twain's boyhood home. You don't get much more American than Mark Twain in Hannibal, Missouri. There's also, of course, places where you can go and participate or see things happening. This is Lafayette, Indiana, the Feast of the Hunter's Moon. And just to remind you that history can be really beautiful. This is the falls on the Sioux River in Sioux Falls. And this is downtown. And it's like, how many places do you go that have downtown waterfalls? But it was important because that's one of the things you learn is any place with running water became important because that was how you powered everything. Sawmills, grain mills, all mills, basically anything that happened to happen, the source of power before engines came along was water. And so that's it. For more adventures, just for what it's worth, this is about 1/4 of what's in the book. So there's an awful lot of other stuff for you to learn about in the Midwest. And anyway, any questions now? Let me see, as they stop sharing, I guess.
Yes, thank you so much, Cynthia. That was great. And we do have a few questions here. I want to invite anybody who still has questions that they haven't typed out yet to do so. But we'll start at the top here. So will there be a listing available of these interesting sites that you referenced? Do you have those listed anywhere by chance? So the sites will be in the...
Yes.
Great.
So they're all in the book. Like I said, this is only 1/4 of the sites in the book. So there will be vastly more in the book. And it's available for pre-order now if you want to get on the list.
And do you have a link that I can put in the chat for people or?
Well, basically either Amazon or the University of Illinois Press.
Great. Perfect.
And the nice thing, for what it's worth, the reason that pre-ordering is important now is simply because everything is so crazy because of the shipping and things being difficult to get. And so it's like they want to be able to order as many books as they need right off, because if you miss the first batch of books, the next batch may be a while down the line because there's so much stuff sitting on boats that they can't unload.
Perfect. All right, so I put that in the chat for people. Okay. We have somebody agreeing here about the Freedom Museum in Cincinnati.
Good.
And
I thought it was just a splendid museum. And heartrending too, you know, and encouraging. And it also brings you up to date. I mean, it doesn't end with the American Civil War. It actually reminds you, by the way, there are countries all over the world that still enslave people. And so I think that's important, is to remember that all of history is still connected to today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Next question here is actually a recommendation. It says Kenosha Civil War Museum is a hidden gem worth the $8 fee.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The Kenosha Civil War
Oh,
Museum.
yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I just saw another question. Some of them were popping up on chat as well, so.
Yeah, and another suggestion here in the chat, there's an outdoor museum in Wisconsin where they have buildings from the different ethnic groups which settled Wisconsin.
It's called Old World Wisconsin. It's in Eagle and it's in the book.
There you go.
Because it's fabulous. It's one of those things where you just can't put everything in an hour presentation. And I went a little over an hour, but it's one of those things where it's just, there's so much to see. And not only is Old World Wisconsin fabulous, but if you're up near Green Bay, they have one called Heritage Hill, which is another one. And that's kind of fun because they and a couple of places do this. And it's like you use distance to reproduce time. So it's like you start at the bottom of the hill is like when the first French settlers arrived. And as you go up the hill, you go through the time periods. So, but yes, Old World Wisconsin's one of my favorites. That's the outdoor museum. And it is one of the things I thought was fun is with the Old World Wisconsin, not only is it different ethnic periods, but they actually know who owned the house and will tell you the history of the person who owned it. And as far as possible, have tried to get the stuff that that person owned. But one of my favorites is the Swedish, because they're all by different groups, you know, but the Swedish group, they didn't have much Swedish furniture. And so the Queen of Sweden donated it.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
That is.
Wow.
And it's up in the Kettle Moraine, so you get a good hit of you know, beautiful wilderness while you're also heading up there.
Absolutely. Related to that comment there, we have someone asking if you can recommend Swedish or Danish special places to visit.
Pretty much Minnesota. No, but I mean, if you look up Danish special places, I mean, there's a reason why companies in Minnesota all have names like Nordic Track and Nordic Wear. And although it's like South Dakota is where pretty much everybody's from Norway. Danish, there's Wisconsin. I mean, the Kringle is Danish and that's from Wisconsin. So they're not like is hugely dominant. You don't have that huge dominant thing that you do like with the Dutch in Michigan, but there are Danish, like I said, the Danish Kringle up there in Racine is our closest hit.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that'll be my next book is where to eat all this stuff.
That same person said, wow, I can't wait to read your book and use it as a guide around the Midwest. I have it on pre-order on Amazon.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, and the thing that I do too in the book is I actually have a chapter in there about how to find more stuff. Because there are so many resources online. You know, for instance, I mentioned a couple of the places that were Smithsonian Associates. Well, you can look up the Smithsonian Associates program and it will list all the places that they support, you know, that sort of stuff. And Carnegie museums. And I mean, there's just a lot of ways to find stuff and every place has something. That's one of the things I keep saying is look up, no matter how, I do a lot of public speaking on the road and I always look stuff up because you just never know what some place is going to have. I mean, the Keokuk, Iowa, it's the geode capital of the world. So I came home with a geode. So anyway, it's there's always something.
Absolutely. This person is asking a clarifying question. What is the name of the living history town outside of Cincinnati with the canal connecting Lake Erie and the Ohio River?
Well, it's not just outside, but it's in southern Ohio and it's old Rasco Village. It's in Coshocton is the town that's nearest. You know, the non-historic town that's nearest is Coshocton, Ohio. And it's about halfway across the bottom of the state there. But yeah, old Rasco Village.
Great. Another clarifying question. What was that huge cone-shaped thing hanging next to the stove? I think it was in the Napier settlement.
Oh gosh. Nope, it wouldn't be the Napier settlement. Let me see if I can find the picture here. Let's see, hit escape. And,
My dad suggests that it may have been the bathtub.
well, I pointed out the bathtub, but that's not cone shaped. But that was, here we go. Is this the one? Well, I was gonna say I could see where's. Oh, okay, share. Is that the kitchen you're talking about? Did
Yeah,
that
maybe
work?
that. I'm not sure what they were, if this was the kitchen they were asking about, but that does look like,
I mean, there's the bathtub over there.
there we go.
And then these are all like pots for boiling your water to put in the bathtub. Let me see what other kitchen. Because Naperville, I just had a couple of buildings. Didn't have a. I think that's one of the main kitchens I have. Let me see if there's a.
Oh, the person said yes, that was the kitchen.
Okay, that was it. Okay. Well, there's the bathtub and everything else is. One of the things worth pointing out though is I don't know if you could how well you could see it, but there's like a metal plate underneath the stove. And that's because the stove is all iron and it would get really, really hot. And of course, you don't want a really blazing hot stove standing on your wooden floor.
Yeah.
So if you go to one of these old places, note that these old stoves will always have a metal plate underneath them of some sort to keep them from catching your house on fire.
All right, 2 more questions here. Do they celebrate old style Mardi Gras at St. Genevieve or other French centric towns?
Um, they celebrate a lot of things. I don't believe Mardi Gras is one of them. They have a tremendous number. Is what you have to realize is an awful lot of the French culture in the United States, because France, and that's one of the things I want to talk about in my next book too, is Europe was a lot different. I mean, France was not a cohesive country yet, and that's one of the reasons why French in Canada doesn't sound like French in France. That's because a lot of the people that came over here were from like northern France, and they spoke something that was sort of a blend of French and Norse, because they were all these Norsemen that had settled up there in Normandy, and they spoke dialects, and so there's a lot of difference in the cultures, and it's entirely possible that they do it. It's like, for instance, in the Amana colonies, they're from Alsace, because Germans were from all over. There was no Germany. It was like German tribes that had settled all over Europe, and so they were from Alsace, and they did not have lederhosen, they did not have dirndls, they did not have May Day or Oktoberfest, but there's big money in dirndls and Oktoberfest, so they have it every year. That's Bavarian, that's not German. So a lot of times the things that came over from smaller groups and stuff, and so sometimes they will adopt some of those things just because it is successful, but on the whole, they didn't necessarily have all the things that we associate with a different place. And that said, like I said, because they need to make money, they may do it. But the things that I saw, all the things I saw were much older French, traditions, and they have a lot of them, but usually revolving around music and food. Which, what else is there? So.
Good point. I think this is a good question to leave off on. How many years of travel does your visiting all of these places represent? How many years did it take you?
I mean, some of these things I've been doing for a long time. I mean, it's one of those things where, like the Feast of the Hunter's Moon. I mean, I've been doing that for 30 years. I actually was a Revolutionary War reenactor for a while, so I've been going there for 30 years. But the last time I went was in 2019. So it's one of those things where I traveled a huge amount in 2019 and a lot also actually in 2020 during the summer, because a lot of these states were open. And so pretty much everything in the book is within the last couple of years. Just because even if I just stopped in to make sure it was still there. So it represents both a huge amount of years and just the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So put a lot of miles on the car.
I might have you unshare your screen
Oh,
there.
yes.
Uh,
Unshare, stop share.
Thank you so much for answering those questions. Um, Very thoughtful answers and a great presentation. So thank
Well,
you for
thank
that.
you.
That
Well,
will
it's just such a
conclude.
great region, you know?
Absolutely. I agree. I'm from here. It's a good
And
one.
another thing that's fun is going around, and I actually do this in the book, is knowing about some of the other foods. Because you run into things like, for instance, I have a little sidebar in there about chislic, which is like the official food of South Dakota, and it's probably Russians brought it over. They figure it's close to the word shashlik, and it's like mutton on a stick that's been deep fried, and they serve it with garlic salt and saltines. But of course, now it's so popular. There's all the little posh hip places that have multiple dipping sauces, and you can get it with different things besides mutton, and you can get it with chicken and with beef. And so there's chislic. I talk about that. Then you get to Nebraska. You've got runza, which is German, which is like a little loaf of bread stuffed with beef and onions and cabbage. That is so popular that there's a restaurant called, or a chain called Runza's, and there's 81 locations just in
Wow.
Nebraska. Um, then I have recipe for one of the classics of the Amana colonies. They gave me the recipe for pickled ham. It's just like you never throw anything out. So if you don't eat all the ham, you cut it into little cubes, chop some onions, and pickle it all. So there's just lots of fun things. Oh, and then there's the Swiss cheese pie from Monroe, Wisconsin. So anyway, so even in a book that's not a food book, I still managed to talk a lot about food.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to reiterate, that is available for pre-order on Amazon as well as from the University of Illinois Press. And that will conclude our travelogue presentation for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for supporting the work of the Geographic Society of Chicago.